Our scripture reading this morning comes from the 20th chapter of Numbers, verses 8 through 13. Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and the water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you have not believed me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them.
In the text that was read a moment ago, Numbers chapter 20 brings the story of the Exodus to the 40th year. In this chapter, Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, will die, and is already before the text that was read, and Aaron himself will die shortly after. 40 years earlier, the Israelites came to the border of the Promised Land. But on that day, instead of listening to Joshua and Caleb say, we can take the land, they listened instead to the 10 spies who spoke of the impossibility of taking the land. And they stated that God had brought them out to kill them. And God gave them what they stated. By Numbers 20, nearly all of those people have died for their unfaithfulness over the course of this 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And only 2 men are left that are going to enter the land of Canaan that left the land of Egypt above the age of 20. That's going to be Joshua and Caleb, the 2 that said, yes, we can. Numbers 20 also tells us that the new generation of Israelites had not learned from the mistakes of their parents. After Miriam's death, the people began to complain to Moses and to Aaron about the lack of water. And they said the same thing that their parents said 40 years earlier. They said, Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. It is not like these people have not seen the providing power of God throughout their entire lives. They still get up every morning and step out of their tent, and lying on the ground before their tents is the manna that God feeds them with every single day except the Sabbath. The clothes that they are wearing are not wearing out. Jeannie says, I have some shirts that I need to get rid of. They're so comfortable. These people have been wearing the same clothes and could have worn the same clothes if that's what was necessary. For the past 40 years, their clothes never wore out because of the power of God. They have seen God provide water time and time again in a desert land. They are still led, literally, by a physical, visible manifestation of God within the camp itself. God descends upon the tabernacle and descends upon the house of meeting in a visible way for them to see. And yet they do not ask God reverently for the things that they need. No, instead, they accuse him. They accuse him of mistreating them by delivering them from the Egyptians who enslaved them and killed their children, only to bring them to the wilderness and to kill them. They accuse God of having planned to kill them from the very beginning. And that is the scene before Moses and Aaron on this particular day in Numbers chapter 20. I understand, as I look at the Exodus and I look at Moses and his interactions with these people, I understand the statement in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, I think a little bit better, when it says that Moses was the meekest or the most humble man, greater than all other men in that respect. He was so very patient with them. And he put up with more than can be fully considered from these people over the course of the 40 years that he's been leading them. Here he is again standing and receiving abuse from these ungrateful, these unfaithful people. And it has been a broken record hearing them say these things and do these things over the past 40 years. He has lost his sister recently. A sister who watched him float down the Nile 120 years earlier. I'm sure that left a hole. I'm sure that has left a point of pain in his heart for her. And here he is, he listens to the vitriol of the crowd, and then him and Aaron return into the doorway of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord descended before them. Oftentimes, this type of situation where you see Moses and Aaron on their faces and the glory of the Lord descending, it's a bad day. Oftentimes, what follows this is a lot of people dying for their unfaithfulness, for their ungratefulness, for their sinfulness. But it's going to be a little different today. You know, in all those other times, Moses and Aaron would plead and beg God on behalf of the people. This time is different. God decides to give the people what they are wanting, even though their attitude in seeking it is abhorrent and disrespectful. God tells Moses to take his rod and assemble the congregation, speak to the rock in front of the people. Water would then gush forth from the rock for the people to drink and for their animals to drink as well. And Moses takes his rod, and in verse 9 even states that he took it just as God commanded him to do. He took his rod like God said. Now, there's a divergence from that point forward. Moses and Aaron gathered the people in front of the rock, and it seems that frustration has built up in Moses. Maybe 40 years worth of frustration. And the people were probably still complaining. They're probably still berating Moses and Aaron while they gather together. Just knowing people, I can almost promise you that's happening. Listen to what Moses says. Listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth for you water from this rock? He asked a question. And Moses calls out their continuous rebelliousness in this statement. He speaks to the people. I want you to note he's speaking to the wrong place. He was supposed to go out and speak to the rock. But he speaks to the people. You know what happened next in verse 11? Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with the rod. Frustration with these people finally got the best of him. What do you think happened next? The Bible tells us that water gushed forth from the rock and flowed to the people and to their animals. There's a part of us, I think, at least from my standpoint, there's a part of us that sympathizes with Moses, right? So provoked, so mistreated over so many years. These people owe him so much. It was Moses and Aaron that begged God at times not to destroy them all. They owed him so much. And they showed him nothing They treated him with nothing but disrespect. And I think a part of us says, I would have done the same thing. There's a part of me that says I'd have done it long before 40 years ago. That's just knowing Nathan. I think there's a part of us that says I would have done the same thing. But here's the thing, though, when we think about that. This had nothing to do with the people's unfaithfulness. It had nothing to do with the people's ungratefulness. It had nothing to do with constant complaining for 40 years. It had nothing to do with all that Moses had done for them. None of that mattered. None of that even factors into this situation. The only thing that mattered on this day was what God said to Moses in that tent of meeting. Everything else was inconsequential. Everything else was insignificant. Listen to God's response to what Moses did. Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land I have given them. Folks, if you side with Moses in his outburst, you side against God. That's where it falls. This whole situation in Numbers 20 is about God, His holiness, and Moses needing to show God's holiness to others in his obedience as he represents God before the people. We continue our series this morning by seeing that God is holy. I want us to look at what that means and how we show God is holy. I mean, He's holy whether we show it or not, but how we show that to others in the life that we live, as Moses was too on this particular day. Holy is one of those words whose meaning, I think, has kind of become greatly diminished because of overuse and misuse. We use it as a term of amazement, don't we? Holy cow. I don't even know what a holy cow is, but holy moly. We use it as a reference to someone who presents themselves as spiritually superior to everyone else. He's holier than thou. We use it as a label for those churchy individuals who seem to be a little too pious, a little bit over the top religious. They're holy rollers, right? And it would seem that the word holy isn't always a good thing. It doesn't sound like it's always a compliment. It's like when you call somebody Einstein, you're not always complimenting that they're smart, do you? Are you? Seems like we kind of use the word like that. It isn't always a good thing from some people. However, the correct meaning and usage of this word is perhaps one of the most important words in all of Christianity. If someone asked you to describe God in just one word, what word would you choose? Loving? Awesome? Merciful? Gracious? Almighty? I think every one of those are applicable, but none of them are capable of encompassing everything or all aspects of who God is. God is so many things rolled into one that a one-word description seems, as we think about it, it almost seems to be impossible to have. But there is one word that both accurately describes who God is and what God is all about, and it is a word that not only expresses one attribute of God, it embraces His entire divine nature, and that word is holy. We look at the word in the Old Testament. In the Hebrew language, it's the word kadosh. And it means to be set apart, to be distinct. Isaiah 57 and verse 15, Isaiah says, "For thus says the high and exalted one who lives forever, whose name is holy." In the Greek language, it's the word hagios. And it means separation. Separation to God. You know, this separation carries the meaning of purity. And how it carries that meaning is that it literally has the idea of being unmixed. In other words, it's not mixed in with all the impurity over here. It is separate from that. All by itself, it is pure. It has never been polluted. So we get this idea of purity from this. So the word holy, in a sense, summarizes all that God is. He is separated from everything. He is unique. He's not like you and me. He doesn't think like you and me. He won't do the things that you and I would do. God is unique and different and separate from us. He is the Creator. He can do things that you and I can't even begin to think of. John chapter 1 and verse 14 establishes the same kind of idea in Jesus Christ when He came to this earth. It says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father." And that word "only begotten" there is probably not a great translation. The word should really just be the unique Son of God. Because there's no one else like Jesus Christ. Of all the men that have ever lived on this earth, no one else is like Him. He's unique. If I'm telling you that all men have sinned, there is an exception to that rule, and it is a unique person. It is Jesus Christ who never sinned as He lived upon this earth. He is the only person that's 100% God and 100% man. He's unique in that sense. And He's unlike you and I in that way as well. Isaiah chapter 53 tried to show this in a visual way when it talked about that He was a tender shoot in a parched ground. So you think about this tender little shoot or plant coming up. It's moist, it's green, it's soft, and it's growing out of cracked, dry ground. He's that unique to everything that was around Him when He was on this earth. He was so different. He was so unpolluted by the things of this world. In like manner, God is holy in all His attributes. They are set aside in their infinite nature. They are set aside in their perfect expression. God's holiness elevates Him far above you and me and all mankind. It is what demands our reverence. It is what demands our obedience. His holiness establishes that all that He does, all that He is, and all that He says is right and good and should be closely adhered to with great diligence. Folks, God's holiness is no small thing. To ignore it demands that there be a response from the justness of God to such a reverence. When Moses struck that rock, instead of speaking to it as God told him to do, when he struck that rock, there were other times when God told him to strike the rock, right? So it wasn't like there wasn't commands back there at one time to strike the rock. But in this particular case, that wasn't the command. But when he struck that rock, he ignored God's instructions. He disregarded the holiness of God for a path that he chose. And he was there representing God before the people, but he failed to represent God in a holy and a true way. And in that way, he did not show God as holy. Showing God as holy would have resulted in him speaking to the rock, as God said. Let's think about another thing. Let's go another direction from this. Think about the Ark of the Covenant. That box that God commanded Moses to build there at the very beginning, to place there within the tabernacle, it was built out of acacia wood. God gave very specific instructions how He wanted it built. And it was built out of acacia wood and then covered in pure gold. It had those two cherubims that had their wings that went across it up on top. And their wings covered the mercy seat there in the middle where God's presence was in this world there in the tabernacle. You have that ark there, and within it is some manna from the Exodus, the budding rod of Aaron, showing that his family, that they are the ones to be the high priests. And then you also had the Ten Commandments placed within it. And it is set there. And it has blood drops all over the top of it. Because once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest entered into that Holy of Holies and he sprinkled blood. He didn't touch it, but he sprinkled blood onto it, the blood of the sacrifice for the sins of the people. And so it would have been covered in blood, dried blood. But there's another feature that we must not forget. 2 gold rings on each side of the ark down toward the base. Now we go forward in the Israelite history, and we come to a point where Eli's sons and all of their sin, they decide that God will just ignore their sin if they just carry the ark before them, as if that was going to absolve everything. And so they carry the ark into battle against the Philistines, and they get beaten bad, and the ark gets captured by the Philistines. Even when Eli hears that his sons have been killed, that doesn't seem to bother him. What bothers him and causes him to fall off the bench backwards and break his neck and die is when he heard that the Ark of the Covenant had been taken. The glory of God. Well, the Philistines take it to their cities, and they keep it for about 7 months. But after 7 months of keeping the ark and all the sickness and all the power of God coming down on them, the wrath of God, let me say, coming down on them, they decided they didn't want the ark anymore. It didn't belong to them. So they put it on a cart and just sent it back toward Israel. Comes to a town called Beth Shemesh. I've been there. I've seen the path it would have taken coming back up the road, but it comes back to Israel. And on the day that it comes to that village, men open it up and they look inside of it, and 50,000 men die. We often talk about Uzzah, and that's where we're heading. But 50,000 men died for looking inside the ark. It wasn't their place. And so they sent it up to Abinadab's house, and he kept it. It remained in his house for 40 years plus. And when David became king, he wanted to bring it to Jerusalem. So he sends a man named Uzzah down there to get it. And he sends a cart and ready a beautiful cart and fresh horses or fresh donkeys, and they're going to bring it back. And they put it on that cart. And we know the story, right? It's going along and it starts to tip. And Uzzah reaches up and he touches the ark and he drops dead. And we go, that was so unfair. David was even a little bit incensed at God about that. Why would you kill him? Because he wasn't showing God as holy. Neither was David, for that matter. Because those two rings on each side, there's a law with those. You put rods through them. And Levites carry the ark wherever it goes. Anything else disrespected God and did not show Him as holy. And people paid the price for it. David got it right the second time and was able to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. We could go back to Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, and they're taking fire from a place that God did not say take fire. And we think, well, that's no big deal. Fire's fire, right? No, it's not. Not if it's where if God says, I want you to get the fire from here. The fire over there is not the same fire in the eyes of God. And fire was sent from heaven and consumed them, killed them, because they did not treat God as holy. Listen to what the Lord told Aaron after that happened. By those, and folks, take note, God doesn't change, so His attitude on this is still the same this morning as it was there with Aaron then. By those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. And before all the people, I will be honored. God gave no ifs, ands, or buts to Aaron about why his sons died. If you're going to come before me, you better come before me and treat me as holy. You will do it, or I will not be happy about it, is what he said. You know, the Lord even forbade Aaron to mourn his sons. He said, you will not mourn them. You will continue to do what you're to do as the high priest, as the anointed one in the temple. And if you do not, you'll die too. Because the high priest of God was not going to mourn the punishment of God upon those that would not treat Him as holy. Holiness is a serious thing. Most of the times when we see God's wrath coming forth upon man, it is because man does not treat Him as holy. And these are just 3 instances that we can see in Scripture. I mentioned before about the sprinkling of blood upon the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. Josephus tells us that in his day and time, when they went into the Holy of Holies, they would tie a rope to the ankle of the high priest in case he did something that offended God, in case he did something wrong and God struck him dead in there. Because they weren't allowed to enter, and they knew that. And you wouldn't be able to get him. And so they would tie a rope to his leg, and if he was struck dead, they'd drag him back out from the Holy of Holies. They were thinking about this. They understood this. Even to this day, Jews do not say the name God. They considered it very holy. They took the letters out of Yahweh, so it would make it hard for you to pronounce the name of God. They held His name holy. I had a friend of mine that was a preacher. He was a chaplain for a police department, and there were some Jewish men on the police department. He would give them religious things, shirts once a year or whatever. But he could never put God on the shirt because the Jewish men couldn't wear it because they felt like it wasn't treating God as holy to wear it. So they have a great respect for God and His name, and something maybe we could draw some lessons from. Fast forward to present day. We think about approaching God and coming to Him in worship, and that was the situations that we see with Nathen and Abihu. We now have preachers not showing God as holy by not preaching the truth, or trying to be liked by how they dress or how they look or how many degrees they have, rather than a reverence for God's holy word. Many are tempted today to not even bother being with God's people as He commands, but sitting at home without good cause. And I want you to catch that phrase, because there are causes. But too many are sitting at home without good cause just because technology allows them to see a picture of an auditorium. But that does not treat God as holy, because He wants His people assembled together. We are to treat God as holy, if it is at all possible. Churches are making a joke out of worshiping God to entertain the masses. And what we do in worship is not about men. Our worship service is not about visitors. Our worship service is not about what people think out here. Our worship service is toward God. We need to understand that and keep that ever in the forefront of our mind. But many are changing God's worship service into a joke, doing it for men. It's not about a holy God for them. Men are drawn to God by lives that we live and truth that we teach in regard to our crucified Savior. Jesus said, "If I be lifted up, I will draw all men to you." To me. Not your gimmicks, not what you do in your worship services. It will be me and me crucified. And if that's not our message, if that's not what we're using to bring people in, then it'll never last. Because if we bring people in with gimmicks, they'll only stay till a new gimmick comes along. And then they'll be off chasing it. Because it's not about faith, it's about like. And people like things for a moment, and then they move on. And they go on to something else. We need faith in our churches, and not just, "I like what you do." Too many people today self-confidently traipse into the presence of God without the slightest thought that it might be a bad idea the way you're doing it. They tromp across holy ground and never once thinking about taking off their sandals or dropping to their knees. Or as Moses and Aaron did, dropping to their faces. It has become about what I feel, what I like, what I want, and not about the holiness of God in many places. Many have lost God. Or at least they've lost the concept, the high and lofty concept of God. And I'm speaking of their bowing to the holiness of God. That's what's been lost. Today we hear people prattle on about God like He's their bosom buddy. They speak of Him as if there's no reason to fear Him. As if there's no reason for us to feel unworthy when we stand in the holiness of God. And there is little sense of awe, and there's little reverence sometimes among people in regard to God. And such audacity only proves that they are truly blind, and they cannot see the light, as Jesus said. That they are dead and do not feel the weight of their sin that resides within their souls against the holy God of heaven. Too many today put little attention to the lessons on holiness demonstrated by Nadab, Abihu, Uzzah, and yes, even Moses. Some have the audacity to charge God. I've heard this in lessons. Have the audacity of charging God with overreacting in those situations. But the reality is that we should all be thankful this morning that we're not struck dead on the spot. When it comes to the holiness of God and honoring God as holy, I promise you that we have all failed to some degree. And I can speak for myself, and probably more than me. I failed more than Moses did. I failed in worse ways than Moses failed. And look at what it cost him. The holiness of God has to be contended with. It has to be understood, and it has to be reverenced. Not everything is sacred. We throw that word around a lot too. It's kind of tied to holy. Throw that word around a lot, folks. Not everything's sacred. Animals are important, but they're not sacred. This earth is important, but it's not sacred. You and I are important, but we're not sacred. God is sacred. And therefore, we must be careful how we treat Him, how we enter into His presence. God is holy, is a holy God, and He must be treated as holy. And if we approach God incorrectly, not much else matters. Jesus talked about worshiping in spirit and in truth. We can do all the right things in the right way, but there's still an inside me component too that God sees. Remember, God told Samuel, I see the heart. Nadab and Abihu approached God incorrectly. They didn't approach the wrong God. They approached the right God. They just did it in the wrong way. They thought they could dispense with the instruction booklet, but they learned the hard way that not just any way is acceptable to a holy God. We must understand that when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to worship, when it comes to our daily living, it is not we who must be pleased, it is He that must be pleased. And our first question is not whether He agrees with us, but whether we come to Him in a way that agrees with Him. We do not decide what is acceptable to God. God is the only one that makes that decision. God is holy. And because God is holy, there is a great moral chasm that sets Him apart from us. A holy God cannot tolerate sin. It is diametrically opposed to all that He is. That is important to understand when it comes to the justice of God. A holy God will not abide sin. He loves everything that conforms to His will, and He loathes those things that do not. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 32 says, For the devious are an abomination to the Lord, but He is intimate with the upright. Did you catch that? Intimate. Folks, this morning we have the opportunity to be children, to have a father. That's intimate. But we get that opportunity when we're upright. When we walk in the light, as John would say. When we do those things that God, when we live a life that's not habitually sinful, but habitually righteous, with the occasional failings that we all will have at times of judgment, where we do sin, but knowing that Jesus Christ continues to forgive us. God's holiness demands that we, as His children, that intimate relationship, it demands that we too be holy. You know, in John chapter 8, Jesus said, if Abraham is your father, do the deeds of your father. And he made the same argument about God. If God's your father, do the deed, be like your father. You are to be like your father. And if God is your father and He is holy, then you are called to be holy as well. Peter says it like this. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 13 through 16. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in the Spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lust, which were yours in your ignorance, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves, also in all your behavior, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Note the commands. He says, prepare your minds to act. Prepare to act as God commands. And Peter then gives them how to do that. He says, keep sober in spirit. Be alert to your spiritual needs, your spiritual shortcomings, and meet them and overcome them. Fix your hope on God's salvation from His grace. In other words, be focused on God. Problem is, we got our focus in 50 different directions, and it's hard to get focused on God. He says, do not be conformed once again to the life of sin that you left before you came to Christ. Don't go back. Don't even look back. Jesus said the man that looks back isn't worthy. Because you most assuredly will mess up the track that you're trying to make. And then he says, be holy. Set yourself apart from the world for a purpose. Set yourself apart from the world for the purpose of serving the holy God of heaven. And notice Peter states, holy in all your behavior. Every aspect of our lives is to be a product of the holiness that we see in the wholeness of who the Almighty is. Since God is holy, to be in His presence, we must be holy as well. We cannot be like everyone else. We can't be like the world. We cannot do our own thing. We cannot follow our own way. We must not carelessly enter into the presence of God. As we are coming this morning, and as we do at other times, into His presence in worship, we have to be something more. We have to be set apart from the world to be in His presence. And like the one we follow, we must be consecrated, set apart, and distinct. That everybody out there knows exactly what we are because they see the holiness of God as exhibited in our lives. We must be holy as He is holy. True devotion to God must find its only expression. And the only way that you can express your devotion to God is through holy living. You know, there's a story told about an accountant. Sounds like this guy kind of had my math skills. But it was told about an accountant who answered an ad for a job at this particular agency. And at the end of the interview, the interviewer asked, he said, I got one more question. What is 7 times 3? And he said, 22. Yeah, see? Well, the accountant left, and he kind of thought for a moment. He thought, I don't... And he actually got his calculator out. 7 times 3, 21, right? So he thought, well, there goes that job. I'm not going to get that one. A guy being hired for numbers, and I messed it up. But lo and behold, about a week later, he got a call back from the guy, the interviewer, and he said, we'd like to offer you the job. He said, I got your last question wrong. Why would you want to hire me? He said, you were closer. So it's sort of the price is right kind of thing. You know, unfortunately, there are many who have the mistaken idea that God is like that interviewer. They feel that it really doesn't matter what they believe or what they do, just as long as they get close. And that won't work with the holiness of God. We must understand that a holy God must be honored as holy. Not just close, but with all of our being. With all of who we are. With everything all the way. Therefore, God only accepts those who believe and follow in His prescribed way. Those willing to give their all to Him in every aspect. Moses gave so much. And yet the failure to show God as holy cost him in this physical world. Now, I don't believe that he was lost, but in the physical world it cost him. It cost him entering into the land of Canaan that he had spent 40 years working to get to. And God said, you can't go in. God, in His love for Moses, did allow him to see the land before he died. And while God's holiness sets Him apart from us and our sins, may we never forget that it is His holiness that drives Him to bring us back. to bring us back to Him through Jesus Christ. The perfect holiness of Jesus is capable and able to bring us to the Father. That's why Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father except by me, because only through the holiness of Jesus Christ as our mediator can we get there. Hebrews elaborates on that as well, as our high priest, the only one that can bring us to the Father. He became that holy sacrifice. The only holy sacrifice ever offered was the sacrifice of Jesus Christ upon the cross. And it was the only sacrifice, because of that holiness, that can take away our sins. Jesus is God. And therefore, He is holy. Treat Him as such this morning by obeying His will for your life in every way. Not close, not if I got the time, not this little aspect of my life, but give your whole life to Him, because He gave everything to you. We can assist you in getting there and coming to the Holy Father, falling down in awe and respect and reverence before Him, and to find the salvation that He offers through His Son. We pray that you will let us this morning as we stand, as we sing.